Welcome to the Bear Hug Experience, where we cozy up to the fire in our digital den and immerse ourselves in the inspiration born from exploring the hidden narratives and inevitable plot twists that shape every compelling startup journey. Join us as we showcase inspirational guests from bold investors with the Midas touch to pioneering entrepreneurs at the helm of today's most thrilling startups. We'll also hear from courageous go-to-market leaders navigating the frontier of emerging tech and the unsung heroes bringing all the people and parts together to form unstoppable dream teams. Here's your host, Kraig Ward, founder and managing director of Bear Hug Recruiting. Get ready for an insightful journey.
The following is a conversation with Aaron Rubens, the co-founder and CEO of Kudoboard, an online workplace appreciation software that's helping tens of millions of people every day at top companies globally work harder and stick around longer thanks to feeling more appreciated at work. Aaron graduated from Tulane University, after which he became a high school math teacher through Teach for America. After teaching, he led the creation of Khan Academy's White House-sponsored four-year college admissions technology resource for low-income, high-potential students. From there, he got his MBA from Harvard Business School and went on to build Kudoboard, growing it into the incredible, cash-efficient enterprise it's become today. Welcome to the Bear Hug Experience. And now, dear friends, fellow entrepreneurs, investors, and startup enthusiasts, here is Aaron Rubens. All right, Aaron. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you doing this.
Kraig, excited to be here.
How are you feeling coming into this call today? What's your state?
I'm good. Excited to have the conversation with you. I was mentioning a couple minutes ago, my daughter's a little under the weather here for the past few days, so that's a little bit in the back of my mind. But otherwise, excited to connect.
All right. Well, good. Well, I want to talk about your mission. It's an important one, and it matters to the world. So why don't we start with you telling our listeners what you're up to these days and why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. At the very highest level, the way we think about Kudoboard is a platform to empower people around the world to celebrate moments that matter. And more specifically, what that means is how do we identify those really important things, typically in the workplace, that people are doing that need to be recognized, and give them the tools to be able to do that in a way that resonates.
Yeah. So Kudoboard, what's the genesis of the name?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think when it started, you kind of go and you try to just figure out what domains are available and what sort of what sort of evokes the type of thing you're doing. In this case, giving gratitude, appreciation, etc., and the format of it is on a board. So it started out pretty simple, and obviously the product has evolved over time, but that's still at its core.
And so it's kudos and board, essentially, is how those two things came together. Is that right?
Yeah, those are sort of the root words that go with it. You're right.
So Kudoboard. All right. Very cool. And this idea of celebrating moments that matter, you talked about it in sort of a B2B context. Is there a play also for people to be able to use it on a personal basis for more of a consumer play, or is it strictly B2B?
No, great question. It actually is used in sort of consumer world as well. So, what Kudoboard started as was essentially a reimagination of the card that's passed around and signed. And if I'm sure you've done the card that's passed around and signed before, and you kind of know it's not that great of an experience. So you have this thing that you're passing around. No one can really write much of anything because it's all squeezed in. You've got to hide it from the person that's receiving it. And it's inconvenient, particularly if people all aren't in the same place. So it was a little bit of this broken process. And the way Kudoboard started was really as a solution to that. So giving people a way to celebrate these moments, particularly if they're not all in the same place and they want to be a little bit more meaningful. So if they want to write a little bit more, include a video, include a picture, things like that, then Kudoboard lets you do it. And so to answer your question, that's in many cases, the card that gets passed around and signed is in the workplace, but it's also, hey, it's grandma's 50th wedding anniversary with grandpa and the families all around the world. Let's invite everyone. So we absolutely do have a portion of the business that's kind of people purchasing individual Kudo boards one-off for personal occasions. And then certainly kind of individual one-off within workplace, and then the larger like subscription use in the workplace as well.
Well, I think people listening to this, are as amazed as I am that this idea of digitizing what otherwise was sort of like a physical experience can become this amazing business. I'm sure we'll get into the story around how it's expanded and its different use cases, but it's so cool to build a business on this workflow, this moment in time. So I can't wait to talk more about it.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And it for me, it sort of started in the analog world where I, a long time ago, was a high school math teacher. And at the end of each year, I'd have each student write their name on a piece of paper. And the idea was you'd pass each of those papers around and your classmates would write something nice about you, something that they appreciated about you. And this is an idea that, another teacher gave me. I take no credit for the analog version here.
Yeah.
But, it was one of the, and I will say to any teachers who may be listening, do not do this at the beginning of the year. It's good once there's like trust that's been built. The students like each other. You've reached a good place in terms of classroom culture. But in any case, they passed it around. And I didn't really think too much of this exercise, but I had students come up to me in subsequent years and say, I put that piece of paper on my wall. It was really special. I didn't know people felt that way about me. And it just kind of, like, to me, reiterated the fact that, like, if you give people permission to say something nice, really magical things can happen. And oftentimes it's about, like, how do you enable that motion and get people pulled in? And when you can do it, sometimes it can be really special.
I'm so fascinated by deliberately turning what otherwise would be kind of an in and out situation. I mean, you could talk about a classroom and say, okay, a bunch of students go through semesters together and then have whatever organic relationships develop, and they laugh at jokes at the class and throw stuff at their teacher and whatever, like there's the natural course of things. But in a teaching setting, the teachers that make such a huge impact on the students are doing things far and above the status quo, right? And so facilitating the deliberate motion, as you called it, in a work context, it's often referred to as a 360 review. And then, it can be done in any setting, right? Like you talked about it, enabling this type of what's already there as latent feedback and potential to let other people see you through the eyes of others can create that magic. I could see how your solution could take what would otherwise just be latent value sitting there, and it could spark something incredible that would be so unique and special. Is that sort of what you've seen happen?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think the one area where I might push back is we usually focus really specifically on kind of that appreciation, gratitude, recognition, positivity. And that's, there's a ton of great platforms out there more for, as you kind of call it, like 360 reviews, feedback. And that's great. But I think where Kudoboard comes in is giving people a space in particular to let people know when they're doing a great job. And it can be for something like congrats on a promotion, like we want to appreciate you on your 10-year work anniversary, things like that. And it can be also for just like more day-to-day type of things. So, happy birthday, congrats on the new baby, like things like that. But it's just giving people a space to really come together. And I think, in particular, and we can get into this later when we talk about the sort of growth story, but when people aren't all in the office 5 days a week and they're still looking for ways to connect and feel a part of each other's lives and a part of the company's culture and all that, giving them some tools to make that easier can be a really powerful thing.
Oh, interesting. So my association with thinking there's a commonality with the 360 review process is a totally different context than
It is. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I mean we have millions of folks using Kudoboard every month, so it's not that no one uses it. More for like feedback board or whatever you want to call it.
Performance reviews or whatever.
Yeah,
Right?
but we actually, when we talk to customers, we pretty explicitly tell them, this is meant to be not a place that's
Critical.
for that's critical. And there's even other, I'd say, like recognition tools where you're giving points back and forth, and there's
Uh,
leaderboards, and it
uh,
feeds into your review system, so your managers can see this. And we actually even kind of push back a little bit on that to say, it's actually nice to have a
huh.
place where you can just give this authentic recognition because you appreciate something someone's doing, as opposed to trying to make it, in some way an evaluation.
I
Because I think
love
that just,
that.
it creates a different tone.
Well, so that was a very deliberate choice you made from the beginning. Like you wanted to stay away from that and create a clear boundary. Like you created sort of a line and said, "This is not what it is, and this is what it is."
Yeah,
In order to facilitate the 100% positivity that you want to foster, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that the nice thing is, like, the more focused we get, the more, for some customers, like, this is exactly what I want, and for others, like, nope, I actually want something
Mm,
that's more part of our overall
yeah.
360 review process. That, and I'm like, great, that's awesome. Let me point you in the direction of some other solution, but
Huh.
it's not what we do.
That's so cool. I love when someone can niche down to the point where it makes it easy for people to opt in or opt out based on what you've chosen you want it to be. I love rather than trying to morph into like, well, we can be all things to all people because that just creates a diluted focus, right?
Yeah.
I don't think we can have too much positivity in the workforce. We need a lot more. So I love that you're enabling that. Let's talk about your superpower or your super passion. You talked about being a math teacher, and we'll get into your story in a minute. But just at a high level, what have you learned about yourself over the course of time that has, your character traits, the different things that are your passions, and again, your superpowers that are allowing you to sort of take this on and grow what is a sizable business? I think a lot of people will be, they hear you say, millions of people use your product. What is it every month? That's significant market traction, right? So, what superpowers do you possess that are really allowing you to drive this thing and continue to grow it?
Yeah, it's not a question I think about that often, but it's a good one, and good to be introspective. Um, I think particularly early on, I really like to get deep on things and understand, like, how they work, why they work the way they work, what's wrong, what's not working. And I think there's so many different elements of the business that when you're starting out, you're kind of jack of all trades, master of none. I still feel that way in many
Hmm.
cases, but I think being willing to go deep on things has been helpful for me. Just so that I could, when it was early days and we needed to figure out, like, okay, why isn't someone using this feature the way we thought we would? It's like, okay, I'm going to figure out how to, you know, track the behavior more closely. I'm going to figure out how to, talk to the customers, iterate, work with our engineers on changing it, like, just like all the stuff that you kind of learn how to do. And then it's like, okay, now that's working. Now something in sales isn't working, and I'm digging
Hmm.
in deeply there because we don't at that point have a built out sales process. So I'm working and figuring that out. So, like, being willing to kind of jump to these different things and then get really deep is something that I enjoy. And I think because I enjoy it, it's become a strength of being able to, like, jump around and then get deep quickly. Um, so yeah, I don't know I can't boil that down to a single word, but being not just willing but excited about going deep on things when I need to is I think a strength.
And you're ultimately solving problems, right? You're kind of jumping from one problem to another, one fire, putting out one fire to another. Maybe it's not a fire, but
Yeah,
um,
hopefully solving problems. I mean, that's the
yeah,
goal anyway. Um,
yeah. And
it's
and you found that this was a trait that you had from like a young age. This is something that's you've been able to go deep on things from an early age. Is that fair to say?
yeah, no, absolutely. I think I've always enjoyed um, kind of digging into something, understanding the inner workings. Um, yeah, from as long back as I can remember.
Yeah. So on the flip side of a superpower or a super passion, we have sort of the kryptonite or the anti-passion. What have you learned about yourself in that regard that you find things that wear you down or suck your energy while you're on this path?
I I really miss some day, like, in early days with Kudoboard, I found myself doing a lot of kind of what I would call, like, IC work, so, individual contributor, and that might be, a deep analysis in a spreadsheet, or working on a feature and the nitty gritty of that feature. And I get a lot of energy from that.
Mm.
I do find sometimes when it's more like jumping from meeting to meeting, talking high level strategy, and these are things that are like highly important. But I don't sometimes end those days feeling as energized and it's probably the flip side, Kraig, of the coin that we were just talking about, which is when you can't go deep and you feel like because you're stretched across stuff and you have to stay fairly high level. I don't find that as energizing, but I do find like as the team expands, more often where my time ends up being spent now, certainly than before.
So on the strategic level rather than maybe the tactical level, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And
Huh.
it's important and I like it, but it doesn't energize me in the same way that it does to get like really deep on a topic, which can be more tactical in the end.
Huh. Wow. That's I won't say it's a surprise, but it's really super interesting. As
It's
CEO.
probably not what I
Yeah.
would say if I was interviewing for a CEO job. So let me just.
I like to stay in the weeds. They're like, wait a
No,
minute.
no. I mean, I think it's just recognizing. In
Yeah.
some ways, it can be a real strength because like when you're working with colleagues
Yeah.
and they want you to be a thought partner in solving a problem, I'm very willing
Yeah.
to like get deep to work together and solve it. And that can be really powerful. But I do think and I find it energizing, but it's just, those are time consuming things. And when you're spread across multiple areas, you can't do that everywhere. So.
Well, I could see that being a huge benefit to having sort of the wanting to go deep and finding energy in that as a superpower, because the number of times I hear the candidates I work with on the go-to-market side at a senior level saying that in their prior job, you know, for example, it happens a lot with like sales leaders talk about how their marketing partner, the CMO or the VP of marketing, was too strategic, right? So in that sense, if the CEO is able to partner with the functional department heads to help be like a thought partner on solving problems tactically, I could see that being a huge benefit if there's a really strong relationship, connection, and collaboration there, as opposed to saying no, I'm CEO, I'm above all of that, I'm just going to work on vision and strategy, I'm going to delegate everything else, you guys figure it out. And the person that only derives energy from doing that could leave their team. I mean, you could probably argue it both ways, right? That both aren't right or wrong, but I could see that being hugely beneficial. And I think maybe it stresses even more importantly, um, having the people that work with you understand that about you in order to have that match with what they want and need. And then you could all build, I think, something really incredible together, right?
Yeah. No, you're right. And I don't think it's always better to be someone who likes to go deep versus always better to be someone who likes to stay strategic. But I think you're
Hmm.
absolutely right that it's about kind of understanding that about yourself, having other people understand that about you too,
Hmm.
um, and then finding the right complements with the rest of the team so that you can still get everything done that needs to get done.
Yeah, because I think on the downside, potentially, like it could be seen as like, oh, this person's a micromanager because they're always wanting to get into the weeds. But that's again where, like having like in an interview process with people you might bring on your team, there's a certain trust, right? There's a certain point at which, okay, I've gone deep enough with you, now run with it, right? So, yeah, no, that just opens up all sorts of interesting thought patterns around like that dynamic would set up something very interesting with how the team got managed and when they pull you in and when you disconnect and let them run with something. So very cool.
Yeah, and you know what, you're bringing up a good point, and it's definitely been a learning process for me in terms of when does it make more sense to let go, take a step back, all those kind of things. And
Hmm.
I think a lot of it is just like if you have the right team and you trust the people that you're working with to do great work with or without you, then you can be there. I can be there as a thought partner, but recognize that if I can't because I have other things going on or whatever else, it's still going to be a terrific, amazing thing that
Hmm.
comes out. So it's just a question of, where can my thought partnership be the most helpful?
Yeah. And ultimately letting other people hold the bag at the end of the day for the responsibility for like, this is your project, not mine.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk about your origin story. Cause I like to, whenever I'd recruit, uh, candidates for jobs, in the first 5 minutes of talking to them, I'll hit them with this question, and it always surprises people because they're not most recruiters don't do this. But I want to do it to you too. And I don't know if I prepped you for this, but I want you to tell me your whole life story with a 5-minute time cap. And I like doing a 5-minute window because some people may like to talk for 15. When they start going, they want to go forever. So they're
Sure.
forced to have to kind of constrain themselves. And other times, some people might be like, I can do it in 1 minute. I'm like, don't do it in a minute. Like, give me 5 minutes of stuff. Like, let's talk about what are the meaningful moments, where you're from, what was your early life like, what were influences, what was your career like, why, whatever you want to tell in 5 minutes. Let's just see what comes out. So if you'll look at the clock and time yourself, let's see what happens if you can tell me your life story and pack as much into it as you can in 5 minutes. Are you game for that?
Yeah, let's give it a shot.
Cool.
All right. So where to start? I was born in Missouri, Springfield, Missouri, and we moved to somewhere a little bit more rural named Charity, Missouri, shortly thereafter that, which I think it was one of those towns that had, village of 67 people when you went in. My dad worked construction. My mom was a college professor. And I grew up for the first 5 years or so in Missouri, maybe a little less than that. My parents sort of joked once I started having like a deep Ozark Southern accent. They're like, all right, we think we need to move. But in reality, my mom had gotten a job at a different university in Michigan. And so we moved to Michigan, and I grew up there in a fairly rural area of Michigan. Very, I think, sort of stereotypical school experience where, you kind of have your group of friends and you play some different sports. I ran cross country and played tennis, but had, a good experience. And I, at a certain point, realized like, hey, I want to go somewhere different. And so I applied to a bunch of different colleges and ended up being very fortunate to get a full scholarship to Tulane University, which was in New Orleans. And I had never been to New Orleans in my life. Went down there to visit it and was just blown away. I was like, this city is incredible. It's so much fun. It's so vibrant in a way that I hadn't experienced, that I ended up going down to Tulane. And so was there for 4 years and, met my wonderful wife, Sonia, there, met several of my best friends there and just had a terrific time. And it's still a place that we try to get back to on a regular basis, though we don't live there anymore. And, from there, it was kind of figuring out like, what did I want to do? As many people are kind of figuring out like, well, what's next? What am I going to do to support myself? And I was always torn between sort of more of a social impact, mission-driven focus and the desire to, maybe to put it a little bit crassly, to make money. I grew up in a wonderful, loving household, but one that didn't have a ton of money. And I think there was always a part of me that wanted to have more comfort than that. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of went back and forth, and I ended up taking a job in management consulting for a couple of years. And I liked it. It was sort of intellectually stimulating, but I did find myself constantly gravitating towards like the nonprofit projects and things like that. And at a certain point I was like, you know what? I think I need to follow this urge. And so I ended up, and I mentioned this earlier in our conversation, kind of making a switch and joined Teach for America as a high school math teacher. And it was just really a tremendous experience. At that time, we moved, we had been living in Boston, and we moved out to Kansas City. My wife was starting her PhD at the University of Kansas. Then girlfriend, now wife, was starting her PhD at the University of Kansas. And I started teaching high school math. And it was, from a day-to-day satisfaction perspective, still my favorite job. And I've always sort of said, one day I'm going to retire and go back and teach high school math. And so I did that for 4 years, or worked at that school for 4 years. And, it's been that kind of pull between that sort of work and then more of like the business arena that I have been exposed to in consulting, and ended up going to business school at HBS back in Boston for a couple of years. And that's kind of this idea of empowering people to give appreciation in groups had kind of been planted, as I mentioned, when I was been a teacher. And going to business school kind of showed me like, okay, you don't have to be some crazy genius to start a business. Like, you go, you start it, you figure it out, and you take it from there. And so it kind of gave me the confidence, if nothing else, to give it a shot. And so coming out of business school is when I got going on Kudoboard.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah, it's been now several years since we got started. And it started out very small scale. It was just me alone trying to teach myself how to code in order to build it. And eventually I was like, I'm not gonna be able to teach myself how to code, or at least by the time I do, I'm gonna be way out of money. So I ended up recruiting my co-founder Kyler on board. And throughout all of this, my wife and I were trying to figure out, like, okay, Aaron, you're not making any money. What's going on here? And we ended up having to kind of, after trying this for a little bit, we moved out to San Francisco because I was like, okay, if I'm going to work in tech, I want to be at the center of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a job there and kind of continued working on Kudoboard on the side because it just wasn't making enough money. But it continued to grow even as I was working on it, like nights and weekends, and eventually kind of reached the point where it was like, okay, my co-founder Kyler and I was like, we can leave our full-time jobs now and go after this. It's reached that level of scale. And my daughter Maya was born around then, which is scary to like embark on this entrepreneurial journey just as you're kind of having young kids and realizing like these are going to be two huge parts of my life that are going to take a lot of time at the same time. But yeah, and I think I'm probably getting close to 5, so I'll shorten the last little bit. But company kind of grew from there, and eventually we had kind of reached a point where we felt like it was important for us to be back in Chicago, where our families were nearby, my wife's family and my family. And so we moved back here and have continued growing Kudoboard and the team is fully remote. So there are folks in all sorts of states and a couple folks here in Chicago, but folks are all over, which has been a great way to allow people to have a life, but also really engage with their work.
Can we talk about any of the numbers around the business in terms of employee count or anything like that you're willing to share? State of the business?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I generally speaking, we have around 20 full-time folks, and then we have around 15 or so contractors that work for us. So in the scheme of things, quite small. And I will say, the business is, and this is an area where I keep things more general, but the business is doing quite well. We could be substantially larger from a headcount perspective, but I actually think, I found when I was living in Silicon Valley, oftentimes people would judge their success by the number of employees they had, and their businesses were wildly unprofitable, and yet they'd raise more money and therefore hire more people, and some of them succeeded and some of them crashed and burned. And Kudoboard for a long time was a bootstrapped business and and it still is a profitable business. And so we grew in a little bit of a different way, where it wasn't about headcount that made us successful or not. It was more, hey, can we grow a business that we don't need venture, private equity backed funding to survive? And so by the time we actually did raise, a round of capital, it wasn't because we needed to. Like we were doing well, we were profitable, we were growing. It was more we felt like we had found the right partner to help take us to the next level.
Yeah. I want to drill in on that right now, just because I don't know if I'll remember to circle back on it. So go a little deeper, like go one level deeper on you wanted that partner and that funding for the sake of what? How would you define like the main reason for taking the money?
Sure. Yeah, I think there were 2 reasons. And so our partner, we work with Peakspan Capital, who's been a terrific partner through this process. And I think at the time we decided to raise a round of funding, there were kind of two real reasons. One was we started to run into questions and issues where we just felt like we didn't have sufficient experience. I feel like we were answering them in a way that was satisfactory. We're like, I don't know, it could be this is the right decision. It could be this. And these are like big decisions that would be difficult to go back on. And when we talk to sort of, a random advisor here or there, it's not that they weren't helpful, but they're just not so invested in your success that they're giving it the thought that you want it to be given. And so some of it was just like having a truly trusted advisor to help us think through, like, what does it take for us to get from where we are now to, creating this truly meaningful business that impacts people around the world. And so that was part of it. And part of it, just to be, and I've told this to Peakspan as well, we grew tremendously during the pandemic as
Yeah.
people were trying to figure out ways to stay connected. And there was a part of us that was like, well, maybe we should sell Kudoboard entirely because we don't know what's going to happen with the business after, whatever after looks like after.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but we didn't want to, because we're like, no, we can take it from here to the next level. We don't want to cash out entirely now, but we wanted to take some risk off the table and say, let's raise a round of financing. It's not going to be a full sale. Some of that is sort of a primary capital into the business. Some of that is secondary capital, but it's not a full sale. And it was kind of a little bit of a middle ground to let us take some risk off, the personal risk off the table for ourselves without selling the entire business, and say, like, let's go for this next level of growth together with a partner that we trust. And, in the end, certainly when what COVID meant changed and people were going back into the office, there was less of a tailwind for us, but it wasn't, we were worried, like, is it going to go off a cliff? We just didn't know what it looked like. And fortunately, growth continued, and we sort of continued maturing our offering as part of that. So some of our worries were unfounded, but still, absolutely would make the same decision again if I was even knowing what I know now about what sort of the post pandemic landscape looks like.
And so was your raise kind of in the middle of the pandemic?
It was mid 2021. So I think that's, I'd probably just find that as the middle, give or take.
So the decision was we could sell, but we should hold on to this, get a partner, and stick it out. And that's no cliff came. But,
no cliff came, but still glad to have that partner on board. And I think, in particular, there's just like questions that come up around, like, how do we structure this part of our business, or is this the right hire, or help us, like they're just helpful in these like moments in time where the decisions can be hugely impactful, good or bad, and having someone you trust, it's been good. Better than I expected. I will be like honest. When we started, I was like, well, it'll be capital, and it lets us take some risk off the table, and it also lets us put some more money into the business, and like those are all good things, and like they seem like nice guys, and they'll be fine, like good to work with. So and I think everything that we've gotten from them since, which has been tremendous, has been upside, and everything that they kind of promised in terms of the level of support, the level of engagement with our business has been above and beyond expectation, which has been awesome. So
that's amazing. Huge shout out to Peakspan. I just interviewed Phil yesterday, so for the podcast.
They've been terrific.
Yeah, it's been so great getting to meet you and other portfolio companies who all share the same sentiment, that they, I think a lot of them probably came in thinking, it's just capital, and then there's all these extra promises too. It'd be great if it worked out, and then everyone's been like, it's exceeded expectations. And as one of their experts community members, I've just gotten to meet you. We actually didn't get to meet at their event, but I got to meet all the team at the event. You were there. We just never crossed paths last year, but it's been fantastic to see how different their team is, their philosophy, the way that the portfolio companies have responded to this kind of unique way of doing a raise and utilizing capital and their strategic support. It's been awesome. So huge shout out to the team there. I want to go back. I'm curious about a few things through your story. So was math just something that you were naturally gravitating toward as a strength? I mean, you could have taught all sorts of different topics, right? Why math?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember now. I had been sort of an econ major that had quite a bit of math within it, and I always liked math. I think there's also something very concrete about it, where there being a right or wrong answer can be a really nice thing when working with students, and particularly, honestly, for newer teachers, where it's harder to be more nuanced. And I think like teaching English, like there's a lot of nuance to being a good writer, and in some ways with math there's less nuance. What I often found with my students was, and in the school I worked at, many of the students were coming in substantially behind grade level. But it was also challenging because some weren't. You'd have kids that were coming in to ninth grade at a ninth grade level, and you had kids coming into ninth grade at a third grade level. And
Mm,
that's a pretty big split all in the same classroom. And trying to figure out how to like bridge that gap and have a lesson that can resonate and move everyone forward, despite the fact that they're
mm,
in very different places. But
mm,
but I often found my first job was really just working with students to convince them that like they can do math. And there's sort of this, I kind of always joke with some of my former fellow math teachers that, you know, we are very willing in this country to say like, oh, I'm not good at math. No one says I'm not good at reading, right? That's not a thing
right.
you say, or I can't read. But people will say like, oh, I can't do math. That's not my thing, and it's just sort of accepted that it's and people just kind of have this, in some ways, mental block around their capability. And once you can kind of like work through that and be like, no, like literally everyone, or not, like virtually everyone can do algebra. So it's just a question of like working through that mental block and getting them excited about what understanding this kind of unlocks in the world. And then it's a lot of fun.
So you've always had an interest in activating people's mindset, it sounds like. So there's sort of a theme, at least that I'm picking up on throughout your life, of how you want to make an impact and like leaning more toward the nonprofit space, and then making these shifts from management consulting into kind of what you're doing today. It's really cool. Can we talk just for a moment about you went to Harvard Business School, right? So out of all the places you could have gone to business school, how did you land on Harvard?
Um, yeah, I applied to a few different places and visited and got into a few different places. I actually, it's a little bit of a cliche answer, but I went to some classes at some different business schools, and Harvard does this case study method where essentially the professors are up there. You read a case before the class, and it can be like 5-10 pages up to maybe 30-40 pages, but it basically lays out a business scenario, and typically it it revolves around a business leader that needs to make a decision.
Hmm.
Maybe there's multiple decisions to be made, and you read the case beforehand, and then the class, and it's typically 90 minutes. The class is about kind of dissecting the issue and then ultimately coming to some kind of conclusion, potentially about the decision to be made.
And
And it's not. Oh, go ahead.
everybody reads it. Everybody reads it at the same time, ahead of time, and then everybody comes
Everyone,
in and
everyone
debates
reads
it.
it ahead of time, and it's
Yeah,
taught in what's called the Socratic method, where the
yeah.
professors are essentially kind of calling, typically cold calling. Sometimes you're raising your hand, but oftentimes,
Mm,
especially in the beginning of class, someone gets cold called, which is like you just get chosen to like lay out your theory of the case and things like that. And
cool.
um, I found it to be, I oftentimes found with more traditional lecture based classes in other areas of my life that I'd get like, my eyes would start getting heavy, and and this just like, I found riveting. Um,
Mm.
and so when I visit, I was like, okay, I want to spend time in this. And it's a very, I will say, like a very non-standard answer because most people are like, oh, Harvard's a really good school, great network, blah blah blah. Oh yeah, and
Mhm.
there's classes too. And the sort of the classes piece is very tertiary to everything else.
Yeah.
Um, but the reason I chose it was because I really liked that method. Now, once I got there, I did find that I really liked that classroom format. Also, it's been about like the wonderful people I met, and actually, it was a friend from HBS who introduced me to PeakSpan, and like some of the things around like that network piece have been absolutely true. But
Mm.
that wasn't the primary driver for me going when I was making the decision.
Huh. That's super fascinating. So then you moved to San Francisco, and then this whole bootstrap story is so fascinating, and this is also part of why I love the Peakspan portfolio companies, because the way Phil described it yesterday on the podcast when I recorded it, he did this like Disney analogy and talked about when you're starting a company, you like wake up in a meadow and look at these mountains in the distance, and then you have to go through this forest, and like, and he talks about like picking up the people that made it through the forest to the other side and had product market fit and had some revenue, and that's where he plays. So it was fascinating. So, and a lot of times he talked a lot about how companies will take certain types of investors on early and just become so diluted that they're kind of written off when they don't find that early traction that they need. So a lot of times that means people haven't really raised before peak span meets them. They're a lot of times first time founders is what he said as well. And so you're the perfect example of that, right? You bootstrapped this company, you went to San Francisco to be closer to Silicon Valley. You had to get a job and do Kudoboard on the side. You started to try to code the product on your own, which is amazing, and then brought on a co-founder. And then, like you said, you were able to get to a point where it's like, okay, me and my co-founder can quit our jobs, and then you moved to Chicago. So I'm curious just what the timeline was from when you first, it sounds like you conceived of the idea at Harvard, right? That was sort of the conception where you built a case around it and then built it from there. Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
And so what was the time frame sort of from kind of product inception to starting to code it, build it to the point where you were actually able to quit your job? Was that a couple of years?
Yeah, it was a few years. I mean, so and it wasn't a straight path. It
Hmm.
started with when I left HBS, my wife got her sort of first tenure track job. It was actually back in New Orleans. So we moved back to New Orleans for a bit. And the nice thing about New Orleans, among many nice things, it's relatively inexpensive, certainly compared to San Francisco. And so
Hmm.
we had talked about like, okay, I'm gonna work on this idea I have, and she's gonna work at the university, and I want to give myself a year. You kind of set these timelines for yourself of like, I'm
Yeah.
gonna give myself a year, and by a year, I'm gonna either be able to raise capital or be sufficiently, revenue generating that I, don't feel bad about myself.
Yeah.
um, and so I worked on it full time for that year, and certainly had like made a lot of progress, a lot of initial sort of traction in terms of usage, but the revenue model wasn't really in place, and the fundraising community in New Orleans just wasn't where it needed to be. And so at the end of the year, I was like, well, I'm not going to be able to raise a round of financing based on where we are in New
Hmm.
Orleans. It's not, on the cutting edge of whatever the cause du jour was at that time. It's AI today. I can't remember what it was then.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
whereas, it's not, there's certain ideas at a time and place where that you'll get money no matter what it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it wasn't in that sector.
Yeah.
And so I was basically like, all right, this, we need to move to San Francisco. And if we move to San Francisco, I definitely can't just do Kudoboard
Right.
because it's too expensive there. So we'll kind of figure it out. So the short answer to your question is, it was around 3.5 years from like getting started on it to where, and it was full time, and then it was part time, and then it was full time again. But it was about 3.5 years until Kyler and myself are like both on it full time together and going, and I have now been on it since then. So it's obviously like a much longer ramp on the bootstrapping phase than when you can go and raise money 3 months in and hire your first team of 6 and all that kind of stuff. The nice thing, it ended up working out really well because by the time we raised, it really was sort of for us, a partial exit, as opposed to when you're raising early capital, and that's not the case. And when you raise that very early venture capital, you're basically saying like, I'm not going to have an exit until we sell the entire business.
Hmm.
Where when you kind of wait and prove out a model and reach a point where you're like, in our case, had grown a lot and become quite profitable, it's just a different conversation that you get to have by
Mm.
waiting if you are successful. But it can be a slower ramp for sure.
It's so interesting. So can you talk about what it was like in the early days when you were building the product and starting to get customers and just what that motion looked like? Was it product-led growth from the start?
Yeah, it was sort of hard and depressing at times, but good.
So what, you throw up a website and do some SEO and then you
And
get some people
people,
on your
boom, 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 everyone was there. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was you know at HBS it started, and at that time it was just me. I created like a Survey Monkey form, and basically and a basic, I think it was Wix website.
Uh-huh.
Basically all the things I could create without knowing how to do anything.
Yeah.
And I put it out there and invited some friends to use it to like for different people's birthdays and whatever. And they would submit their little posts on the Survey Monkey forum, and I would pull all of them into like a PowerPoint and try to make it into something that looked good and deliver it at the end, like entirely manually. Nothing about this was interesting from a technical perspective. Um, but saw what it could kind of bring out in people, and it was like, oh, okay, we're getting some like really nice sentiments that are being created here, and it's kind of creating this like really nice feel good end product that's bringing people together. And so then it was about, all right, like recruiting Kyler, who's my co-founder, who could help really lead the charge on the technical side to build the product that it didn't require me, hand making each Kudo board in PowerPoint, and then kind of going from there. But it was really sort of a product led journey, and really still is. We try to keep the product, while continuing to build like functionality and use cases and expanding that, try to keep it simple enough that anyone can kind of hop in and get started without needing like a heavy sales process or a heavy onboarding process. And that's always been an important thing for us.
And so the nature of this type of product is one that one person picks it up and tries it, and they're plugging in a bunch of other people who then get exposed to it. So it has sort of this natural virality component to it, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And that's sort of been the story of our growth in large part, is that natural virality. So I'm at company X, and I create a Kudo board and invite 30 employees, and some number of them, maybe not immediately, often not immediately, but some number of them create one, and it kind of spreads and spreads and spreads. And now we have the point where any given Fortune 2000 company has thousands, if not tens of thousands of employees that have used Kudoboard oftentimes in the last year alone. And so that's where it kind of becomes a powerful case to be made to create a bigger business, which is moving from all of that ad hoc intermittent use that happens at companies to sort of an enterprise-wide plan, which now we've expanded the functionality to include broader kind of like peer-to-peer recognition options to celebrate company events and milestones, ability to kind of like automate things like birthdays and work anniversaries, or bulk create to do. We just have a company in a little bit that's celebrating around 1,000 employees that are getting like a big end of year award, and they're bulk creating 1,000 of these Kudo boards, making it available to all of their broader group of 50,000 plus employees that can add their notes of appreciation, and then the boards are getting delivered to these award recipients at the time that they've selected. So building that ability to kind of use this appreciation at scale has obviously taken time. But when we go to companies, we never talk to companies who don't already have a lot of usage happening internally. And then it's not a conversation about would your employees use Kudoboard. It's like, well, obviously your employees would use Kudoboard. They're already using it. So that's not a question. Now it's just a question of like, is it worth spending more to get a company-wide solution that includes things like integrations and automations and single sign-on and a bunch of the other things that oftentimes you need for a true plan that can serve the entire organization versus more of the ad hoc use. But we don't have to say like, oh no, we swear your people will use it. It's like, no, obviously they'll use it. It's already happening, which is a nice place to be able to start the conversation from.
Wow. And you saw that from the beginning. Like these were inherent ingredients that you saw at Harvard. And you said, wouldn't this be nice if all this came to be? Like the hypothesis that you formed early came to pass. There's not a whole lot of surprises around it, right? Or were there?
I think you're giving me a little more credit. I actually had no idea it was going to live mostly in the workplace world when we started Kudoboard.
Oh, no kidding.
We put it out. I mean, I was like, hey, people use cards all the time. If birthdays happen all over the world. Like, no idea that it was going to be mostly a workplace tool. But that's where it resonated more, just from a perspective, particularly, again, once companies were kind of thinking about hybrid work models and things like that, and how to keep people connected when they're not all in the same place. So that part, I think, took some discovery. And, maybe I would have done it differently if I had known that from the start, in terms of like some other ways we set it up. But from there, once we kind of recognized that use case as a core one, then we were kind of off to the races.
So looking back, how many years have you been in the market with this, roughly?
So Kudoboard started in 2015, and
Okay.
it's grown tremendously, particularly kind of 2018, 2019 onward,
Hmm.
because again, there's that time in the forest, so to speak.
And so just looking back, can you identify the top one, two, or three like big whoa moments? Like whether it was an aha with the product pivot or whether it was like, whoa, this is working. I'm just curious. I mean, because it sounds like you put something out there like this, and you're not quite sure if it's business or consumer or whatever, and it like I just have this visual where you like get sucked into an organization, and then it's like boom, and I'm just curious what can you point out looking back were the big spikes of like whoa, what are some of the whoa moments that you've had?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's been really interesting is, most organizations use Kudoboard internally, um, for things like birthdays and work anniversaries and the peer recognition or whatever else. But
Hmm.
sometimes there are organizations that like to use it in more of a public way. So as an example, the Carter Center has used Kudoboard for Jimmy Carter's birthday for the last several years, and this year they had sort of a well wishes one for him and his wife
Hmm.
when he entered hospice.
Hmm.
Um, but when organizations use it publicly in this way, they're looking to not just sort of broadcast it internally, but also, let folks around the world know about it. So suddenly it's not just our efforts to spread the word about Kudoboard. Suddenly the Carter Center is spreading the word. Suddenly, and I can, the NBA, they did one for like a player that got injured and they wanted to send him, a get well Kudoboard. So they invited, NBA fans to post. And suddenly you're like just getting
Whoa.
exposed to a much broader group. And those have been really interesting waves to ride. And I think there's a lot of overlap between how GoFundMe works in that way and how Kudoboard works in that way. Where with GoFundMe, they have these big spikes around these big campaigns. Most are a small group of friends and family that are invited, but there are some really big campaigns that pull in a ton of people. And Kudoboard has a little bit of a similar pattern where there's a lot of like smaller uses and then some really really big ones that can pull in a lot of people to the platform.
So when you have these spikes, I mean, I don't want to. I really want to continue down the track of the whoa moments without getting too much on a tangent. But I guess I'm, I'm trying to imagine being you and seeing these things that are completely unexpected, where it's like, oh my gosh, the NBA just did this thing with one of the players, and then there's this big wave of sign-ups, I suppose is what it looks like, um, which is followed by revenue, and then does it equate to uh-oh, I need to hire more people to service this? Or are you, like you talked about, with being capital efficient, with 20 employees, but you've got a pretty sizable business, you've learned how to have technology handle the delivery and fulfillment of your product, correct? To handle the
Yeah,
waves.
I the waves, we've built the product to be highly scalable in terms of like the number of users who can be using it. I think
Hmm.
where we are continuing to grow now and plan on continuing to grow is like once you sign on enterprise customers for these enterprise wide plans, they do, I think rightfully so and fairly so, demand a level of like service and attention that when people
Hmm.
are kind of using it more ad hoc, they don't expect. And
Yeah.
so, that's just part and parcel of moving to, serving businesses that who their employees aren't buying individual Kudo boards, but rather they're saying we want to make Kudo board available to everyone in the organization. Um,
Hmm.
that's hard to automate or abstract away, that piece around customer success within the broader organizations. But it's typically not, answering like there's a bug or what's this technical question. It's more like, how do we give you the tools you need to be successful at launch? How do we give you the tool? Like, how do we make sure that you're comfortable with everything that's set up so you can go and use the product well? And that's where I think, aside from the engineering side, where we're always looking to like add folks when it makes sense, that's an area where we see a lot of growth on the sort of the sales and customer success side as we work with larger organizations.
Well, you got, I don't want to say lucky, but you clearly have made some decisions that allow your superpower of wanting to go deep benefit not only your product in the workplace, where you've deliberately chosen to say this is a acknowledgement celebration product. It's not a critical scoreboard leaderboard kind of thing. So you framed it in the positive there. And then when you're actually engaging with customers, they're saying, hey, we already use this. Help us make this more cohesive. Like you get to go deep on, please help us aggregate and combine all of this stuff together and then make it work for everybody in a more simultaneous fashion. like you've, I'm so fascinated that you have created a situation where you get to stay on the positive side, whereas opposed to some of the other businesses out there that are struggling with trying to get product market fit from a sales led motion, where they're trying to get into these enterprises and just beating on doors and trying to get all these different champions in different departments to like see the use case for their product and adopt it, whereas your stuff is organic. So I just feel like if anyone's listening to this that doesn't have sort of a product led growth motion, I'm sure that they're just wondering how can, I mean, and obviously the trend that we're in now is this product led growth to sort of a hybrid model, and product led growth is obviously a very hot topic right now. So it's so cool that you've been able to engineer things deliberately or not to allow for you to play in this more of a positive energy realm. It's great.
Well, it's the grass is always greener, Kraig, because I look at it, I'm
Sure.
like, oh man, these places that have these big sales teams and this like really repeatable motion, and like we're waiting for these spikes that it's hard to control,
Yeah.
and it's hard to say, hey, how do I put in $1 and get out two? Whereas
Mm,
so there, it truly is. It's always funny because I'll talk to folks that have much more of like a sales led process, and they're kind of like, how do you do the product led? And I'm like, no, how do you do the sales led thing? How does it work? So it's the grass is always greener, and I think in some ways, sales led companies ultimately still need to have a product that's great in the end, or they
mm,
won't survive for the long term, because you can't, a great salesperson can sell something, but they can't get you to renew if the product didn't meet the need. Um,
right.
and similarly, like I think product-led companies like us, ultimately as we mature, like we have to mature our sales function as well, because it's hard to be fully product-led, particularly as you work with larger organizations.
Yeah. So what other whoa moments can you point out if you were to grab another one or two of them?
So for me, one of the most powerful things, and as I mentioned, it was sort of a long journey through the forest with Kudoboard,
Mm,
but there have been these just like really powerful use cases, not because they pulled so many people into the platform, but just because they really felt like it mattered to the people that were involved. So, like as an example, there was one. It was for a children's hospital based in the UK, and they created the board. I think it was actually like around the holidays. But they created the board and invited families who their children had been served at the hospital to write notes to the doctors in the NICU, and where the kids had been, and they had, I want to say, almost 1,000 different posts on this board of people. And typically people were putting these pictures up where they had side by side picture of their child in the NICU on one side, and then now their child like 7, 8, 9, 10 running around on the playground or whatever else on the other. And just talking about how impactful, it's like a quick moment in time for this doctor in the NICU that happened, 8 years ago, but just showing, what it's enabled. And they ended up like you can print Kudo boards out as like posters, and they printed out as a giant poster and like put it up in their ward and stuff. But it was just really cool to see it bring people together like that. And I think, another example that we see kind of commonly, and we ended up building a use case around it because we saw it so commonly, is people actually using Kudoboard when someone passes away, to
mm,
create sort of an online memorial for them. And it happens, in sort of the consumer, so to speak, world with Kudoboard, but it also happens in the workplace. At very large workplaces, 50, 100,000 people, like unfortunately, like people pass away, and people are looking to come together and kind of honor that person. And those use cases tend to, people are just more effusive in those instances, and you kind of create this thing where then you can, print it out as a book and give it to the widow or widower, and you just have something really powerful that comes out of it. And so, you had asked about whoa moments. I think particularly when we were like still working around like, what's the revenue model here? How are we going to grow it? Like, is this a little bootstrap business? Is this a business we're going to raise capital? I think those sort of moments of emotional connection that Kudoboard allows people to create were what kept me really motivated, and said like, no, I mean, whatever happens with the business, this matters, and I want to make sure that this works, even if it can't be some giant whatever. I still want this to exist in the world, and so I'm going to keep pushing forward. And so I don't know if that's a whoa moment or just what was a big motivator, but it was those sort of use cases are what kind of kept me going, even when things maybe weren't as good on the business model side early days.
One thing that strikes me about your model that adds a tremendous amount of complexity as you look to grow and scale, the mechanics of this are such that, you've got sort of a consumer use case, like you talked about with sort of somebody passing away, outside the workforce. And so you have all these people signing up, and then you've got people in the business workplace that are using it. Um, I don't know if I want to get super granular in how you're doing the segmentation, but it sounds like a really complex problem to figure out how to reverse engineer who these people are. I guess you can just look at. Are you willing to answer the question of how do you differentiate and segment and understand how to collate these different groups to understand usage? I mean, usage patterns is obviously built into your product in some way, but it just sounds like a complicated thing to understand how to prioritize who you go out and support unless they're reaching out to you directly. I guess maybe is that how do you only deal with inbound that are asking, or do you have a proactive way of grouping them and then figuring out who you want to prioritize?
Yeah, so we can. Most of our growth has been inbound,
Okay.
but we certainly have now moved more towards like, hey, how do we think about accelerating the process of company-wide adoption?
Hmm.
And it certainly is possible for us to see like where we're getting critical mass of usage at particular companies, and then say, okay, we know how big this company is. That's public data. We know how many people at this company are using Kudoboard. That's a pretty high percentage. We need to go figure out who to talk to here. So that it's not nothing rocket science about it.
I mean,
I think,
business emails is typically the identifier
yeah,
versus the personal.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Got
yeah,
it. So
yeah.
maybe not that complex. Okay. And
Not
then
that complex, no,
you can just,
fortunately.
you can reverse engineer. Okay. Size of company. Okay, cool. How many champions, certain titles. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of research on the back end, I'm assuming, but if it's all inbound too, with a mix of proactive outbound, that's cool. What are you seeing in terms of, like, is this a crowded space? Or have you differentiated in such a way where no matter what people try to compare you to, you can say, yeah, I know you're making that correlation, but really this is different. And these are the different differentiators for it.
It is in the broad world of ways to give appreciation in the workplace, it's a crowded space. There's a lot of different tools out there and a lot of different platforms that, even if they didn't start out in the space, have kind of moved into it over time. Um, I think the most common like direct substitute for Kudoboard is there's a more of like a card-based version of our service versus more of our board-based version, which is kind of like the most close direct substitute. But then there's also like a lot of other um, engagement, recognition, whatever platforms that are out there. And for us, it's really about, we talked about earlier, but like being focused about what we are and what we aren't. So like,
Hmm.
hey, we're not the leaderboard point system, transactional, you give me 20 points, I give you 20 points, we get rewards type platform. We
Hmm.
partner with some of those platforms and we think they're great, but it's not what we are. We are, and kind of just like defining how people use Kudoboard and really showing people like how their employees are already using the product. That's the easiest case to make, which is just to like, let me show you how your people are already using this today.
Gotcha.
Um, as opposed to trying to like come in and convince them that they have the need.
Well, you can tell I asked the question because I'm still operating in a paradigm where that's necessary, and you're like, no, no, no. Hear me, what I said earlier. We're taking existing users and we're just empowering them and enabling them. So it's clearly coming from my own lens that I'm so accustomed to living in.
Yeah. And again, grass is always greener. I look at them like,
Right.
man, going to talk to a customer who's not already using your product and making a sale, like that sounds crazy. How do you do it? So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just how things get built over time and you kind of get used to a way it works. So
Yeah. So you and your co-founder were able to quit your jobs, and then you start scaling the team. And so I want to talk about culture and core values if we can, because core values and culture are obviously such a huge part of what your product is hopefully helping companies that have their own core values and culture. I mean, you're trying to make that more of a realized reality, right? So within your own company, as you started to put your team together, what can you tell us about sort of the core values that were fundamental at the beginning, and how you've been able to sort of maintain them over time and as you've grown the team?
Yeah. We in the beginning with Kudoboard, I think it was we didn't sit down on day one and say, what are our core values and
Right.
sketch them out on a paper. I think it was more after a little bit of time, and particularly once we started hiring other folks, and it wasn't just me and my co-founder, starting to um, realize like what were the qualities we were seeing that felt like they were moving us forward, and what were the ones that felt like they were holding us back.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I think about it is like, what are the things, and some of it is maybe aspirational, like what are the things that we want to do better that we don't do today, but like what are those values that like when we're hiring folks, we want to say like, hey, this is what we're looking for, and if this is you, amazing, and we're so excited, and if it's not you, that's okay too. That's great actually that you know that about yourself, but like let's make sure that we're upfront that this isn't a fit. And so I think the more you can like lean into who you are and who you aren't, the more you're going to get people that fit within the organization and are equipped to succeed, because what they bring is what you need. And so like when we think about like what our values are, like some of them are kind of focused on what our product is and how that bleeds through to our organization. So around like, how do we delight our users and then foster a culture of gratitude, not just externally, but also internally with the
Mm-hmm.
organization. Some of it is about, being a really capital efficient business to grow. So it's like, hey, how do we do a lot with a little and prioritize simplicity? So it's like, we're not going to go out and raise some $100 million round of funding that we, go to the moon or die trying in 2 years. Like we're going to build this business in a, responsible, capital efficient way. We're going to succeed, but we've got to do it by being smart about how we deploy our resources and getting people that are kind of excited about that challenge, as opposed to, I think, being more used to saying, hey, I just need more resources. I just need more resources. Being like, no,
Mm,
these are the resources we have. How can we make the most of it? And it's just like a different paradigm.
yeah.
That some people, that's really energizing to say like, this is what we have. How do we make the most of it? And for others, it's more of a question of like, well, no, how do I get more
Mm.
resources? And so I think kind of testing for that is really important from a values perspective as well.
That's amazing. I was so curious where you would go with that, and how you'd be able to test for it. But that one seems like you could weed people out pretty early on. Are they self-selecting out based on that? Are you finding, or do you have to? I'm curious, like where in the funnel of it, like a recruiting process, that is that put like like way at the beginning, and so you don't talk to many people that don't fit, or do you find that you have to kind of adjust for that, like in the first few steps of the process?
I think it's mostly, but not exclusively, self-selecting. And
Hmm.
the reason I say that is I think, you know, there are lots of great jobs in, big tech where you're going to
Hmm.
get a lot of resources, and the pay is great too. Now that doesn't mean it's easy, because it's definitely not. But there is sort of a level of comfort, I think, that you get from the structure that's already in place. And what you don't get is you don't get to come in and like have a huge impact across across a wide part of the product that touches a large number of people. Like typically you're fairly siloed. And so usually people that come to us are people who that succeed, are folks that like have had this startup experience, that know the kind of impact you can have at an organization that's smaller, and are really, really energized by that. Where I think we've maybe learned as we've gone is like, there are also folks who have mostly worked at larger organizations, but just sort of aspire to work at smaller organizations and don't actually quite know what that means. Not from like a comp perspective, because we are, competitive certainly on that side, but more from like what does it mean to be scrappy? What does it mean to be to do a lot with a little, and like work with a fixed set of resources? And so I think that's just an area we've become more cautious around, which is like, hey, if they haven't worked at a smaller organization in the past, and they think that it's what they want. Is it what they really want? Or is it sort of like, because I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this myself, like, who do I want to be versus who am I? And those aren't always the same thing.
Yeah.
And you can kind of I think people can get themselves in trouble, myself included, when you don't know that about yourself. And so that's an area I'd say most people self-select out because they know, like, no, I need the resources, support, et cetera, of like a larger company. But some people like come from that world, but still think they want to be in sort of the small company space. And it's just an area where we test a little harder to see, like, is this really the right fit?
So that seems like a fundamental pillar of the culture of Kudoboard, right? Are there other legs of the table, if you will, metaphorically, that would help define sort of the core values and culture components besides that one?
Yeah, that one being sort of the scrappy, do a lot with a little, that
Yeah.
piece.
Hmm.
Yeah. I think another one that is important to us is, and I'll put these two together. One of these is kind of like one of these core values that I think every other small company, startup, Silicon Valley, whatever, has, which is like acting like an owner.
Hmm.
And but I think it was present at the last company that I worked at, and it resonated, and it felt like, we do want to make sure every single full-time employee, we do make sure that every single full-time employee has equity. We do want them to be invested, not just in their own personal success, but the success of the company. And it makes a difference. And I think like that one kind of goes along with, we have a value around speaking up. And the idea is like valuing voices and feedback from every member of the team. And the idea being like, we want this to be a place where like you have enough feeling of ownership and the organization is sort of flat enough where you feel like you can really speak up regardless of who you're talking to. If you have a great idea, if you have a concern, whatever it is, that those don't get lost in an unnecessary hierarchy. So, and I will acknowledge, like, those things change, I think, as organizations grow. Like, it's easy to say, hey, we're flat, we're not hierarchical when we're under 100 people. What does that look like at a larger organization? I don't know yet, but as of now, it's something that we really look for, is like, how do we keep things like an ownership mentality for every employee, a flat feeling where everyone can speak up is important.
Okay. So are those kind of the two primary, or is there like a third leg?
Yeah, the third one was sort of the one that I had mentioned originally, which is around like delighting our users, fostering a culture of gratitude, just like this feeling of like, I feel very lucky to get to work on a product that is fundamentally about bringing joy. And we want to do that for our users. We also want to do that for each other and, recognize and appreciate each other. And so those are sort of, we technically have 6 values, but I kind of put them in like 3 buckets.
Yeah.
Where it's kind of the, how do you work? Are you scrappy? There's do you have that ownership mentality and are willing to like speak up and take and thing? And then there's finally like, are you, is that belief in like bringing joy to our users, to our fellow colleagues, does that matter to you? I think when you have those 3 big legs, there's a good chance it's a good culture fit, which is great.
And have you learned anything interesting around testing for those 3 things in particular? I'm sure it's been a process of evolution over time, but is there anything unique about what you've learned in testing for that?
Like before you bring someone on board?
Mm-hmm.
I think we're still figuring that out, to be honest. I have come to appreciate reference calls more than I expected.
Yeah.
I think they're more important, and particularly if you can get like a back channel reference that's not directly from that person.
Mm-hmm.
There's no substitute, right, for working directly with someone for any period of time.
Yeah.
And I think, for better or worse, within the first few months, I think it's very clear on both sides, like, oh, this was a great fit, which is most of the time the case, or you know what, this wasn't, and that may be our fault more than the candidate's fault. Like, this wasn't the right fit, and so we're going to need to make a change. But I don't think we've gotten perfect, certainly, at figuring it out before we start working with the person directly. So I will say, like, we have had a few employees who started working with us sort of like as contractors or part-time or like other ways where like they had other things going on, but they were drawn to our organization. And so started working with us in some capacity. And we love that because it's just a way both sides to be like, hey, is this a good fit? And then it's such an easy hire to make.
Yeah.
Because you're like, oh yeah, they're awesome. We know they're awesome. Let's get them on board.
Yeah. Yeah. The try before you buy sort of thing makes total sense.
Yeah, but it's tough. And I don't expect folks to be like, oh, sure, take me on as a contractor and, we'll figure it out down the road. Like, again, for most people that doesn't work, and we're not looking to do that for everyone. It's more just occasionally it kind of happens just because of people's life circumstances where they want to start out part-time or on like a trial basis or whatever else. And we're always amenable to it because I think it's just like a nice way on both sides to sort of de-risk the situation.
And how do you keep people together when they're working virtual? And was this idea of being a virtual company something that was pre-COVID or COVID reinforced?
So it was something that we had started pre-COVID, but it was certainly reinforced by COVID. And we do get everyone together for offsites. We do think there is no substitute for at some cadence for just having people in the same room. Not so much for the quality of the work, but just for like building that connective tissue. So I don't want to, there are I know some like fully remote organizations that it's like they literally never all meet or even ever meet anyone in the company in person. And I don't think we're so far on that end of the spectrum. But, there's a lot to be said for sometimes it's just good to have days where you're doing mostly heads down work and you don't have a commute and you can just focus and get stuff done. And I think, remote can be really powerful for that. And so then it's just a question of like, how do you make sure that people still feel connected when it can be so in some ways isolated by definition? I don't think we've solved it all. I mean, we certainly try to, we use our product internally, certainly. So for some like peer-to-peer recognition, for work anniversaries, for shout out, like we use our own product, but that's obviously just like one part of the equation. It's also, we have some just like different structures in place around sharing feedback and having regular one-on-ones. And like, there's just some other stuff, but I will say, I still think we're experimenting and trying to figure out like, does it make sense to bring everyone together once a year, twice a year? Does it make sense for maybe individual teams to have like meetups that happen on a more regular cadence? So we're still experimenting, as I feel like a lot of companies are at this stage. But it does feel like the other thing that sort of happened is now that there's more of a sort of a shift, I think, towards hybrid and away from fully remote, like the people that are drawn to companies that are more on the remote side, like know exactly what they're getting into and have self-selected in because the benefits of it outweigh the costs.
Yeah.
Whereas I think during COVID, it was just such a situational thing that wasn't always the case.
Yeah. Well, it's cool that it allowed people to like be forced into it and then be able to really test the benefits and see if they could hack it or not.
Totally. And then I will say my perfect world, I actually wish we were more hybrid than remote, but there's so many people in different states now that it doesn't even make sense. But we've started to try to build a center of gravity in Chicago. And we're going to continue hiring here to some degree. So I think over time, we're going to have some hubs where more than just one employee or two employees live that start to feel a little bit more hybrid anyway for those folks that want it.
Yeah. Have you found any particular departments are important to be more face-to-face than virtual? Even if it's just the leaders?
Yeah. I mean, this won't come as much of a surprise to you probably, but I'd say our engineering team in particular is pretty comfortable with remote, whereas some of the more, I'd say like customer facing roles, so like success and support, marketing, things like that, have just more of a desire or craving and maybe get more value out of being in the same place to kind of iterate. And I think that's in some ways just the nature of the work where, I think it's mostly the nature of the work. And also there's probably some personality preferences as well that go
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah. So what does an average work week look like for you? I mean, I'm sure it's varied week to week, but just at a high level, I guess I want to tie this into the prior question around kind of managing a virtual workforce. Do you guys have just like a Slack, a Slack account, and you're doing like sort of, weeklies per function, and then you get together once a week as like a group or a monthly kind of cast the vision for the team, check in on KPIs? Like how do you kind of keep everybody together?
Yeah.
Um,
So it's sort of like what are the rhythms and rituals that we
Yeah.
have that drive us forward? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there's some key tools we use, Slack, Zoom, Notion, that help us stay just sort of like coordinated virtually. And then, we have a daily, typically 15-minute stand up
Hmm.
that happens by team. So, there's the engineering team that has one, and marketing sales folks that have one, and success support has one. But that's basically just kind of like what are you working on? Are there any blockers? Anything that you need help on? Kind of like a status check, just to see if anyone needs to be unblocked on anything. Um, and then once a week we have an all hands where we just bring everyone together, and it's a little bit of an update on anything material that happened. We kind of go back and forth every other week. One week is sort of like OKR check-ins. How's that moving? And the next week is more general announcements, product releases coming up, new customers that we're working with, things like that. And then it goes back to OKRs the next week. So that kind of goes back and forth. And then once a quarter we do like a bigger OKR, OKR for those that probably most will know, but for those that don't, it's more like goals essentially. So at the end of the quarter, we'll kind of check in more formally on progress against goals and things like that. But nothing here is revolutionary. Most of this has been cribbed from like other companies that people have worked at that we've just sort of adopted here as well.
Yeah. No, I love the whole organic flow of this. So as you look ahead to the future, even just the next 12 to 18 months, you know, we talked about shooting for the moon and, fighting your way to get there, and it's just an unrealistic objective. But, when you think about growth rates, one thing Phil from Peakspan had talked about in my conversation with him yesterday, he's like, there's a respectable growth rate, growing, he just threw out the example of like 50% a year. Um, do you have any sort of thoughts you can share around, and it doesn't have to be around growth targets necessarily, but what are your thoughts on priorities over the next 12 to 18 months and how people that are listening could play a role in that in some way?
Yeah, well, the nice thing about Kudoboard is, everyone in the world has birthdays and work anniversaries and retirements and farewells. So first, would love anyone to try Kudoboard, and there's some pretty low commitment ways you can try it in terms of like free trials and things like that from our website. But one of our to answer your question on like where are we going with the business,
Mm-hmm.
we sort of see the big opportunity here is like as the critical mass of we're really good at what I'd call like ad hoc celebration. So when people want to, I as a manager want to celebrate one of my colleagues, create a Kudo board, we've got a lot of stuff and it works well. I think where we've made strides and still have room to grow is on like the integration, automation, making it a solution that if I as a company say, I want to make sure every single person at my company receives a Kudo board on their 1, 5, 10-year work anniversary, and it's integrated with our HRIS system so that it stays current with employees coming and going. And if a manager is out, it automatically gets assigned to a different person. Like there's all these nuances to make it done well at scale. And it's not like every company that you work with is working off the same systems. So that's an area we've made huge strides over the past year, and it remains an area of critical focus, which is basically saying like, hey, when we're working with these companies and moving them from this ad hoc use to kind of a more of like an initiative that's owned oftentimes by either HR or internal comms or whatever else, but that's kind of like owned and has like goals behind it for the company-wide things, making sure that we have the tools in place to play well with their systems and do it with high fidelity at scale.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, when I think about the things I'm most, it's kind of like non-sexy, like integrations, automations. It's like not sexy in some ways, but at the same time, it's what makes a product sticky and powerful
Yeah.
across an organization, is like making sure that you play well and play nice with the systems that they use.
I think it's sexy. I was
Okay,
gonna,
well, fair enough.
I was gonna say I could see how. I mean, ultimately, the companies you're trying to serve, again, it comes back to enablement, and the only way that you can do that is making it as frictionless as possible for them. I mean, how and another kind of aha or just thing I would imagine you would look forward to is more ease in being able to delight your customers by the inherent integrations and feature sets you have, where you can see the speed of the adoption and usage and having company goals and initiatives that go through your product. Like, how amazing is it that you get to create this lens for these leaders who are trying to really align this gigantic organization? How do you, inject more joy and have the company's goals push through that is, and have it integrate with the larger scope of the business is so cool. Um, so tell
Yeah,
what other focuses besides sort of just making the product more sticky and like less friction for the kind of target?
yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the big things, and this one's a little bit of a paradox that we're facing, is oftentimes, particularly once it's like a broader company-wide initiative, the question is like, well, how much engagement are we getting out of Kudoboard? How
Hmm.
many people are using it? How many boards are being created?
Yeah.
How frequently is it being used? Things like that. But one of the challenges is, when you create, for instance, a Kudo board for someone's retirement, it tends to be super thoughtful. The things that people um, write, the product turns out super nice. They can print it. It's a great experience. But when you start having it for every birthday, every work anniversary, all these different things, sometimes it can feel a little bit. It can start to, without, if we're not thoughtful on our side, it can start to feel fatiguing. And
Mm.
the challenge is that also, but those more frequent use cases like the birthdays and work anniversaries are also are also showing that it's being used a lot, because there's a lot
Mm.
more birthdays and work anniversaries than there are retirements in an
Oh yeah.
organization and things like that.
Okay.
So I think that the paradox is, how do we make sure that even for frequent use and frequent use cases, Kudo board stays fresh and stays delightful. And so that's why I feel like we've got some wood to chop, and we got some exciting ideas in terms of like upping that delight factor so that there isn't sort of fatigue around the product, because we know that's a risk, right? Like we're asking you to do something, and it's a small ask, which is, hey, sign your colleague's Kudo board, but we're asking you to do something that like you don't have to do. No one's going to get fired because they didn't sign a Kudo board, right?
Right.
So it's got to be something that like you believe matters to the recipient. It's fun and easy to do, or at least it's got to have a certain level of smoothness and fun in order for it to be well received, because of the nature of it, and what you're trying to accomplish. And so that's just another area that we're always thinking about, is like what can we do to up the delight factor, um, because the last thing we want to do is drive a ton more engagement and people just be like, another Kudo board, another Kudo board, another Kudo. Like
Oh.
that's not our goal. So we've
Mm.
got to make it so that you're excited, and we've got some pretty fun stuff in the works, as far as that's concerned. But just making it so that it feels like some level of freshness as the product continues to grow in usage.
So when you're laying in bed at night and you're thinking about this business, I would imagine the product is a large focus, and upping that delight factor. Is it fair to say that's one of the main things rolling around in your head?
It is. Yeah, and my background's in product. I've
Hmm.
I've spent a lot more time in recent years on the sales side,
Hmm.
and success side, and I think that oftentimes happens with folks, in leadership roles at companies as they're growing. They just, it's good to stay close to the customer on the sales and success side, but really, product in some ways is where my heart is. It's what keeps me up at night. As like, hey, is this piece fitting with this piece? How are these?
Hmm.
How is this all coming together to create a cohesive experience? All that kind of stuff.
So what gets you excited about looking ahead for the next 12 to 18 months? What other things come up for you that are just you're really, really excited about hitting these particular things? Is there anything else that you haven't mentioned?
Are you talking, Craig, specifically product wise or more broadly?
More broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I we have a team now that like several of the folks have been with us for several years, and folks tend to stick around at Kudoboard. And what that means is it's nice because I feel like we've reached a point where like we're kind of firing on all cylinders.
Yeah.
And that makes it exciting to bring new people on because you kind of feel like, oh, okay, we've got our ducks in a row with who's in here today, and now we can start like building on that. And so part of what's exciting me right now is just sort of like the internal dynamics and realizing how some of the things you thought about, like, hey, can this team operate at this level of, excellence? And we're like, we can, and we've gotten there. And now, like, how do we add more people to it and still operate at that level of excellence? So that's in some ways what I'm most excited about, because if you get the right people, you can do, it's more important than any one feature because they're kind of like, the infinite resource of awesome things you can deliver once you have the right people on the team.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. I want to do some questions here as we start to wind this down. Talk to me about beyond the 12 to 18 month view of things. This can be on the personal level and business or just one, but I'm curious when you look 5 years out, and everybody I'm sure has the same reaction to this where it's like, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. but I like to just have this as a fun question because it's fun to pretend like we can predict the future or at least point towards where our true north might land when we think about, like a 5-year window. So if you had a crystal ball, what might an outcome look like for you, whether personal or business or both?
Yeah, I can give you both. I mean, one thing that's been really nice on the personal side is, from when I left college until moving to Chicago, I think I had counted, I moved 18 different houses. And a lot of that was just like here to there, same city, but then also multiple cities as people, going to do different education things and this, that. So just a lot of movement. And it's so nice now to feel like rooted here in Chicago. And my kids, they go to school 3 blocks away, and we love the school they're at. Our local neighborhood public school. We're going to be my daughter's in kindergarten now. It's a K-8 school, so we're like, hey, we're here
Yeah,
for the next
cool.
9 years.
Nice.
And I'm like, it just feels so good to feel like rooted geographically and to start like building community where you feel like you're going to actually be in a place for long enough for it to matter.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously nothing to do with Kudoboard, but it's a nice rooted feeling that we have right now, which I'm very grateful for. On the Kudoboard side, you're right. I'm often thinking more in the like 12 to 18 month time frame in terms of like what do we need to do to evolve the product, as opposed to the broader time frame. But I do think there are some like exciting opportunities a little bit farther down the road, in terms of there's a lot of potential partners doing awesome things in like the HR tech space.
Mm-hmm.
And we often have outreach to say, hey, how can we pull Kudoboard into our platform? We don't want to build it. It's a lot of work to build. We already have our own core thing. So that's something that we've started to invest in now. And I think it's going to become more and more important as time goes on, is like being a good partner that other platforms that kind of play in the broader like HR tech space can pull in. So that's an area that we're really excited about getting deeper on. Again, we have a couple of partners now that we're excited about, and I think just continuing to evolve what we can provide to them, so that and making it easy for people to kind of pull us in is a critical area of focus in the kind of medium to longer term for Kudoboard. And I think that also is good for customers because people want integrated solutions where their different things are connected, and it doesn't feel like you have all these little islands. And so I think the more we can do that, the happier customers will be as well.
Again, more stickiness, right?
More stickiness. So that's one area. I think the other is we're always sort of surprised at some of the use cases that we see for Kudoboard. There's kind of like the 95% of uses that we see again and again and again. And then the 5% that are like, I would have never guessed that it would be used this way, but wow, they're really getting a lot of value out of it. And I think that can be such a powerful way. And I mentioned, earlier in the conversation that we ended up building out like an option to use it for memorials because we just saw enough people using it for it that we said, okay, we need to change some of the language. We need to change some of the options. We need, it didn't work out of the box in a way that we were proud of for that use case, but we saw what we needed to do to make it work. And I think in the longer term, that's just like something that we always want to keep an eye on, is like, what are those nascent use cases that we see only a few folks using because it doesn't have X, Y, or Z. But if we added that, it could really unlock a lot of value. And that's what gets me excited as a product person, is like keeping track of those long tail uses that maybe could become less long tail over time.
Okay. I have to ask you about generative AI, because in this context, I mean, you think about what the promise is to like save you time and like pre-generate text as just
Yeah.
one simple example. And yet,
Yeah.
you think about in the marketing world with the inundation we already all get from people sending us stuff that they've, taken a lot of time to craft, whether it's custom or at scale. And then you think about what generative AI is going to do to just bombard us even more with all these automations. And you think about, how does that take away from the authenticity in some way? So I guess the question is, what are your thoughts on generative AI in the product, and are you doing anything with it?
Yeah, it's definitely something that we've experimented with. And I think you're right that, like, listen, we could make it where, all you have to do is click a button and it generates your entire message and your picture and whatever. And that's
uh,
pretty easy to do.
yeah,
And we've stayed away from that. And oftentimes when we talk to customers, they're like, no, that's not what we want here.
right.
We want it to feel like it's real. We want it to be real.
Hmm.
But I think there are some things we can do around giving people the ability to sort of start and give prompts and help them craft messages, because different people have different levels of comfort with, you know, giving gratitude, showing thanks. Some people need a little bit of help. And I think generative AI can be really interesting in terms of that. Like, you asking a set of questions
Hmm.
that people can kind of like answer, and then that helps them craft
Mm.
something powerful that they can give to someone they care about. I think there's some opportunity there. So we've kind of played around with some options there, and ultimately I think it's going to be something that is a part of the product, but isn't. There's no substitute for feeling like it is or it being a real person behind it who actually cared enough to give it some real thought.
Hmm.
Um, and so I don't see it as sort of a fully automated thing, because at that point, what are you even doing, right?
I have I'm torn when it comes to, creating blog content using generative AI, because there's sort of the philosophy of, I'm going to use it to help me get started, or I'm going to get myself started, and then I'm going to use it to kind of, tighten things up. And, it's cool to think about it in the context of your type of product, where people's natural inclinations might be pretty, narrow in the number of facets they might hit a particular acknowledgement with. And you could I'm sure without even generative AI, you can give people multi dimensions to look at a way to start their message. And generative AI could, make that even faster and easier. So it's just an interesting time to be alive when this technology is coming and being built into all products. And,
For sure.
we talk about the frothiness of the market right now is all AI, all the VC money's going toward it. And what'll it be next? Who knows? But no, it's with this particular product, it does. I could imagine being in your shoes, being like, another sort of quandary around what to do with this.
Yeah.
Um,
No, absolutely. It's definitely it's an exciting. I think there's a lot of. It's not the number one thing our customers are asking for,
mhm.
and so it's not where our primary focus is. But I do think it's something that, if done thoughtfully, can add some real delight and ease of use to the product. And so it's something I really am excited to kind of explore.
Well,
Um,
you just think about everything that like can be automated should be automated, and I don't think that's true, right? In this particular sense, it's like this is actually the time when you want to be as human as you possibly can, and as heart centered, and as thoughtful, and as, again, as human as you can.
right. Right. I mean, it's kind of like, you could theoretically give let's not talk about, appreciation, but just talk about like feedback. You could just be like, "Hey, AI, look through all of my emails, interactions with person on Slack, etc. You probably have a sense for how I feel about them. Based on that, craft my initial feedback message and I'll edit it from there." And
Hmm.
like, talk about impersonal. um,
Yeah.
uh, but we'll see. It's a brave new world we live in, so we'll see how things go. But it's not something that I say to myself, like, how do we automate? I want to automate everything except the core of what someone actually wants to say on it. But like, hey, can we automate, setup and delivery and, onboarding and offboarding? Like, those things are great to automate because those are just like the hassles that you need to go through in order to get the value from the core of the product. But like the core is about building this emotional connection and resonance and culture among people that I don't want to automate.
Okay. Can we talk about internationalization? Just briefly, I want to just understand your thinking around different languages, different countries, just high level. What are your thoughts sort of looking toward the future about accommodating those types of things into the product?
Yeah, it's super, super important. And definitely, I'd say I'd put on the docket for sort of the medium to longer term. So we already do quite a good job on accommodating like the various characters and languages people want to write their messages in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we support maybe like 80 or 85 different languages now. There is a question, and part of it is just it's used all over the world. And so people will come to us and say, hey, I'm writing this in X language and it's not showing up, or it's not going right to left when it should, or it's not showing up on the print correctly or whatever. So we've over time done a really good job of getting that piece down. And that usually is sufficient for our companies that are international. We have a lot of companies, they're based in the US, but they have, 10,000 people in various countries, other countries around the world. But there is a next level in terms of the site being translated into different languages, the currencies, if people want to give gift cards and stuff, the currencies being, that requires more nuance country to country. And it's definitely an opportunity. I mean, listen, gratitude, appreciation, recognition is not just a one country thing. It's relevant everywhere. I think it's just a question of like complexity of the task versus opportunity and when it's going to fit in the roadmap. But it's absolutely going to be a thing.
Oh, it just sounds like there's so many fun, cool opportunities ahead of you in all these different areas. I really appreciate the way this has all flowed. I want to switch into, sort of some questions that we'll do rapid fire. Just high level, what comes out is good enough. So tell me about what you believe the world needs to understand or embrace that will make the world a better place in the coming years.
I think the vast majority of people mean well, and they're just coming from different places. So trying to understand where they're coming from.
I love that. What's something that's happened to you in your life or career that few people will believe? You can take your time on this one.
Yeah. Something that always surprises people is they ask me how I met my co-founder. And it started with I put up a job on, I think it was like Elance or Odesk or whatever else.
Yeah.
And it was totally and I basically had a ton of people apply that, there were lots of folks that had, they had worked, 75 different jobs and made a total of $5,000 on the platform. And then Kyler, my co-founder, I feel like he didn't even apply. I think I reached out to him, but he had like one job and made a ton on it. I was like, okay, well, someone trusted this person enough to work with him for a long period of time on a single project. And that was a good sign versus the vast majority of people who were coming in. So I reached out on a whim because the language that the site that I had started, that the site was started in, he specialized in that particular language. So I was like, well, at least we know there's a fit there. And it started out super transactional, and eventually we got together in person after probably 4 or 5 months, and we just really clicked. And from there, it took off as far as the partnership is concerned. But that was never the intention. This was very much like I'm going to hire a contractor to help me get it off the ground and take it from there. And it turned into something that's been a terrific partnership.
That actually works for a question I was going to ask you about, the biggest hiring success story that you've
That is definitely the biggest hiring success. I don't consider it a hire because he is, a partner at this point, but certainly in the beginning it was a hire, and it was certainly the biggest success.
Well, let's talk about the advice you could give to some people out there listening. What would you say if somebody wanted to approach you and come work for you? Can you think of a really unique way that they could demonstrate being above the bar, a unique way to approach you to really blow you away and make you want to hire them right there on the spot?
Sure. I'm a product person, and I always appreciate when someone has used our product, understands our product. Sometimes people will write like their thank you notes. They'll send like a Kudoboard to us as a thank you note.
Mm-hmm.
And that's nice. It doesn't have to be a Kudoboard, but just like the idea that they like understand the product well enough to know how you can use it. It's a nice thing. It lets us have a conversation at a level that's a little bit deeper than folks have. And because it's such a like a broadly accessible product where like anyone can get on there and use it in 5 minutes, that always scores points with me, to be transparent.
We'll just give them the answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe that's a little too explicit. You don't have to send me a Kudoboard, but it's good if you played around with the product a little bit.
I would honestly hope that people would intuitively pick up on that anyway, but I love it. If you could go back and tell yourself one thing early in your career, Aaron, what would you say?
Early in my career, I think the big advice I give to anyone who's like thinking about starting a business is the thing that I had wished I had known myself. I wish I had known myself, which is like these things aren't linear. They don't necessarily go on the timeline you want them to. And just like recognizing that up front and giving yourself some level of like patience and forgiveness as you go through these processes is big. Because I have so many, I was the same way. I was like, I'm gonna give myself 1 year. And after the 1 year, if it's not there, then I'm gonna quit. And so many friends I have talked to over the years are like, I think I want to start a business. I'm gonna give myself 6 months. And by 6, and like no one ever hits the timeline. I don't want to say ever. It's rare to hit the timeline that you set for yourself for these things that are so amorphous and so you don't even know what you're getting into at the start. So just, I think just, give yourself all sorts of grace as you're figuring these things out in the early days.
Okay. So you've been sent back in a time machine to visit your 18-year-old self, okay, to give them advice for their future. You have 10 seconds to say 5 words. What are they?
18 years old. Invest in Amazon. I don't know. I got some words left over. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, that's a cheat. That's a cheat for sure. I love it. Do you have any advice for, you've just given advice for sort of the early entrepreneur. What about somebody that is maybe at or a similar stage as you? I guess this is an indirect way of asking you, like, what are you learning about yourself and the advice you're giving yourself today about how to go to the next level? What could you share with somebody that's kind of a now lesson that you've either just gone through or going through today that could help other people at a similar stage?
I do think it's better to not make a hire at all than to make the wrong hire. And I think just like, particularly when a company is on the smaller side, like every hire has such a big impact on the culture, and I've certainly been guilty of this where I'm like, well, I got 3 people and this is the best of the 3, so let's do it. And that's almost always the wrong answer. I think like you go in being like, I'm excited about this person. This is the right fit. And it's worth it to wait for that. So that's something I'm trying to tell myself, to be like, yes, you have goals, timelines, metrics you're trying to hit, but like, and you need this person to hit it, but like, it's worth it to wait to get the right person. And so there's certainly some tension in those 2 statements, but it's, I think it's just always something that I'm trying to keep in my mind.
Well, if you weren't so capital efficient, you would be under the gun to do things that were probably out of character, out of desperation.
This is true. So it's nice when there's more money in the bank account every quarter than the quarter before. That makes it a little easier to say this, perhaps. So I will acknowledge that.
Well, congratulations on setting this up in a way that you have that freedom to choose when and who, because nothing is more important than the people that you have on your team, right? To give our listeners a view of you and things that really light you up and recharge your battery, what are 2 to 3 non-obvious, more personal things about you that you're most passionate about outside of work, or any fun rituals or mindfulness practices that make life more meaningful?
So I grew up playing tennis,
Mm-hmm.
and I just started playing pickleball a few weeks ago, and I'm really loving it. So I'm excited to pick up a new hobby, and encourage others who haven't tried it yet to give it a shot. This is sort of embarrassing, but I visited a friend and there was a long bike ride that he had signed up for. And I was like, well, I'd like to do it. And so I bought a bike, and I rented a bike, but bought a bike helmet. And I got back to my house, and this is like the biggest sunk cost fallacy. I was like, well, I've got this bike helmet. Now I've got to get a bike. Because otherwise it would have been a waste to buy this bike helmet. So I ended up getting super into biking. And that's sort of another thing that it's just a great way to take your mind off things that I enjoy a lot.
So you're in Chicago.
So
So are you road biking? Are you mountain biking or both?
yeah, road biking. Not too many mountains around here.
Okay, so thin tires. Okay. Are
And
you
tires,
are you
exactly.
putting the whole tracksuit on and everything with the whole
Like
getup? Oh, yeah,
the whole
okay. You're turning
whole
into
get
that guy. Cool.
the whole yeah.
Are you part of the
Like,
pack? Are you cruising around with the
no,
pack now?
no, lone wolf.
Oh,
I
you're a
wish I
lone
was part
wolf.
of it. I
Oh,
wish I was part of it. I'm just I feel like my timing never works to do it consistently, but
I'm betting
yeah.
in 3 months you are part of a pack. I can see
All right.
it.
All right. I like it.
Anything you'd like to leave with our listeners to wrap this up as closing remarks?
I appreciate Kraig the opportunity to be here, and yeah, would love anyone who is interested in ways to bring their organization closer together to give Kudoboard a shot.
Celebrating moments that matter.
Celebrating
So
moments that matter. Exactly.
such a cool way to wrap it up. Thank you so much again for coming on the show. I've loved the conversation.
Likewise, Kraig. Appreciate you having me.
And that's a wrap on this episode of the Bear Hug Experience. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please give us a like, click, follow, or subscribe. We appreciate you taking a moment to give us a quick rating and a written review so we can continue to expand our reach and inspire the next generation of leaders to help make this world a better place. You can also contribute to the conversation around this specific episode by using the comments section of whatever platform you're on. And last but not least, if you have direct feedback, a question, or a guest you'd like to suggest that we have on the show, please shoot us an email at podcast@bearhugrecruiting.com or visit bearhugrecruiting.com/podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and we look forward to having you join us again on another episode of the Bear Hug Experience. Woah.